I want you to just picture the exact moment you pull up to a gas station today.
Oh, yeah. We all know that feeling.
Right. You step out of your car, you grab the nozzle, and you start filling up the tank.
And you're just watching the numbers.
Exactly. You're standing there watching those little digital numbers on the pump display ticking past. But they aren't just ticking. I mean, they are flying.
It's brutal.
It really is. You watch the price cross this threshold that you genuinely thought was an anomaly, and eventually it hits this record-breaking €2 and, roughly 50 cents per liter?
Yeah, 2.508 to be exact.
Which is just wild. It's a number that actually shatters the terrifying energy market peaks we saw back in, the total chaos of 2022.
It absolutely does.
So you finish pumping, you look at the final bill, and there's just this immediate visceral sink in your stomach. It's a highly personal, very tangible hit to your wallet.
Right, because you feel it instantly.
Exactly. But as you get back in your car and grip the steering wheel, the real questions start forming. Like, what specific invisible gears are turning across the globe to force this number so high right now?
And the big one, when does this hit everything else?
Yes. How long until this exact same inflation bleeds into every other aspect of your life?
Well, I mean, it really is the defining kitchen table economic question of our time.
Yeah.
That number staring back at you from the pump, it's never an isolated metric.
No, it's just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Exactly. It's the visible tip of a massive, heavily interconnected global iceberg.
Yeah.
What you are paying for at that pump is the real-time mathematical manifestation of geopolitical instability.
Bleeding right into your morning commute.
Precisely, and very efficiently, too.
So to really understand the nuts and bolts of how that bleed actually happens, we're doing a deep dive today. And our source material is this incredibly revealing transcript.
It's a fantastic read.
It really is. It's from a Dutch interview conducted by the news outlet De Telegraaf. And it features the chief economist at Rabobank, which, if you don't know, is one of the largest financial institutions in the Netherlands.
Massive footprint.
Yeah. So we're going to extract the core data, the predictive models, and the economic realities laid out in this text. We're looking at how global conflicts secretly rewire local economies, right?
Right. And how these major banks calculate the financial fallout of a war in basically real time.
And most importantly, what this complex web of data actually means for you, whether you're buying groceries, running a mid-sized business, or just trying to understand the housing market.
But I do think, before we jump in, it's critical to establish our analytical boundaries right here at the start.
Good point. Lay the ground rules.
Because the source text navigates through some inherently political waters. It discusses the geopolitical conflict in the Middle East. It references timelines projected by political figures like Donald Trump, and it evaluates the specific subsidy policies of the Dutch government.
Yeah, it touches a lot of third rails.
It does. So we need to be clear that our objective today is strictly impartial. We aren't evaluating the morality of foreign policy. We're not endorsing any political figures. And we are certainly not judging government administrations.
No taking sides.
Not at all. We are here purely to reverse engineer the economic models presented in the text. We're looking exclusively at the math, the historical data benchmarks, and the structural realities of the global supply chain.
Okay, so let's get straight into that math, starting with this really brilliant contrast the interviewer sets up in the opening moments of the transcript.
Oh, the car question.
Yes. The scene is set, right? Everyday drivers are practically crying at the pump over these record gasoline and diesel prices. And sitting right across the table is the chief economist of this massive bank, and the interviewer asks point blank, "Do you drive a gas car?"
It's a great, slightly confrontational question.
It is. And the economist admits that no, he drives an electric vehicle. Because it's a corporate car provided by the bank, internal policy dictates it must be electric.
Which immediately creates this tension.
Right. The implication just hangs in the air that the economist is insulated, like he's laughing all the way down the highway while the rest of the public absorbs the shock.
And it highlights a very common assumption, about the divide between macroeconomic analysts and the everyday consumer. But the economist immediately dismantles that assumption.
He really does.
He points out a mechanical reality of the European energy grid. Driving an EV does not grant you immunity from a fossil fuel crisis.
Yeah, he makes the point that Unless you're strictly charging that car using a closed-loop system of solar panels on your own private roof, you are completely tethered to the broader grid.
Exactly.
And if the global price of natural gas spikes because of a conflict in the Middle East, well, the cost of generating the electricity flowing into that EV also spikes.
Which brings us to a really vital concept known as the merit order effect in energy markets.
Break that down for us.
So in many European power grids, the price of electricity is determined by the last, most expensive unit of power needed to meet demand at any given moment. Okay? And very often, especially when renewables like wind or solar aren't generating at peak capacity, that marginal unit of power is supplied by natural gas plants.
So natural gas is kind of the floor?
It's the price setter, yeah, for the entire electricity market. If gas prices surge, electricity prices surge in tandem. You might not be buying gasoline, but you are buying electricity that is priced largely by the dynamics of the natural gas market.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Energy is essentially, it's like the flour in a bakery.
Like that analogy.
Right. Even if you walk in and have absolutely zero intention of buying a baguette, maybe you just want a chocolate chip cookie or slice of cake.
Sure.
If the wholesale price of flour doubles, every single item in that bakery gets more expensive because the fundamental base ingredient is compromised. You cannot escape the flour.
You really can't.
In the global economy, energy is the flour.
That captures the structural reality perfectly. And the source text notes that this was the definitive lesson following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine.
Because it hit everything.
Everything. After a certain gestation period, the prices of absolutely all goods and services began to rise sharply. Because the production, refinement, and transportation of literally anything requires energy.
It's the inescapable bottom layer.
It's a bottom layer of the macroeconomic stack. So those invisible global forces, a closed shipping lane, a geopolitical standoff, a threatened pipeline, they are dictating the literal cost of moving your physical body, heating your home, and just maintaining your standard of living.
And we feel that pain downstream, 1 liter at a time. But these major financial institutions, they aren't just reacting to the pain like we are. They are required to map the entire shockwave before it even arrives.
That's just an incredibly stressful process.
Yeah. The transcript gives us a really rare behind-the-scenes look at how these banks actually forecast the future. And it centers around this frantic weekend of February 28th when the Middle East conflict dramatically escalated.
The timeline detailed in the text here gives us an unvarnished look at the velocity of modern institutional forecasting. It kind of strips away the illusion that economic reports are these static, leisurely academic exercises.
Oh, totally. Let's walk through the exact sequence of events because it's wild.
Okay.
So the Rabobank Economic Research team publishes a comprehensive, highly detailed quarterly economic report. This document maps the international context, the macroeconomic forecast for the entire Dutch economy, granular breakdowns for every underlying business sector, everything.
It's a massive undertaking.
Right. And The Economist reveals that this huge quarterly report was entirely finished and scheduled for publication on the Thursday following that specific late February weekend.
Which means the baseline models were locked.
Done.
The data was scrubbed, the narrative texts were written, and the layout was basically in the scaffolding.
But then the conflict escalates over the weekend. The team comes into the office on Monday morning, they look at the news, and they realize their pristine, finished report is effectively obsolete.
It belongs in the trash.
Pretty much. They acknowledge that it would be professionally absurd to publish a baseline forecast on Thursday and say absolutely nothing about a brand new global conflict with massive supply chain implications.
Right.
So they scrap the baseline. They have about 48 hours to create entirely new war-adjusted economic scenarios to hit their Thursday publication deadline.
And we really need to examine why a commercial bank undergoes that level of frantic recalibration. The interviewer asks a crucial question here. He says, you have to do this for the European Central Bank, right?
Right, the ECB.
Yeah, and it points to the regulatory reality that banks are not drafting these models purely for public relations or thought leadership.
They are heavily regulated entities. They're bound by strict compliance frameworks.
Precisely. Under frameworks overseen by the European Central Bank, massive institutions like Rabobank are required to engage in continuous, rigorous stress testing. They have to prove to the regulator that they understand their specific risk exposure at any given moment.
And they are global.
Yes. The text notes that Rabobank has portfolios and operational footprints in South America, Australia, New Zealand, and across Europe.
Wow.
So when a geopolitical shock occurs, The regulator expects the bank to instantly model how a sudden spike in energy prices or a supply chain disruption will impact their loan defaults, their capital reserves, and their overall liquidity globally.
So those 48 hours weren't just about updating a newsletter.
No, not at all. They were about recalculating the bank's mathematical survival parameters.
You know, I read that section and I immediately found myself a bit skeptical.
Oh.
Yeah, as a listener, you have to wonder. War breaks out on a Saturday. By Monday morning, a team of economists sits in a conference room in the Netherlands and attempts to predict the deeply chaotic, unpredictable nature of armed conflict by Thursday.
It sounds impossible.
It does.
Mhm.
How do you actually model the economic fallout of a war in 48 hours when you don't even know what the military generals are going to do next?
Well, the interviewer pushes the economist on that exact skepticism. He essentially asks if they're just throwing a dart at a board and picking a scary number.
Right, are they just guessing?
And the response is a fascinating breakdown of applied econometrics. The economists aren't playing military strategist. They aren't guessing troop movements or political decisions. They rely entirely on historical time series data and established market sensitivities.
But what does time series data actually provide them in an unprecedented crisis? I mean, every war is different.
It is, but the data provides the mathematical relationship between cause and effect. They look backward to build their forward models.
Okay, give me an example.
We have historical blueprints for how global markets react to supply shocks, whether it's the 1970s oil embargoes, the Gulf War, or the 2022 energy crisis.
Right.
They know, with a very high degree of statistical confidence, exactly how a 10% reduction in oil supply impacts global GDP, or how a sustained $100 barrel of oil ripples through the European industrial sector.
Got it. So the machinery, the model is completely built.
Exactly. What they need during that 48-hour scramble are simply the new inputs.
The new raw materials to feed the machine. And the source notes that Rabobank has dedicated oil and gas analysts stationed in the United States who are intimately connected to the physical energy markets.
That's the real-time feedback loop. On Monday and Tuesday, the team in the Netherlands is pulling real-time market assessments from their U.S.-based energy experts.
So they're getting the ground truth.
Yeah, they take those new baseline projections, say, a revised cost for a barrel of Brent crude or a revised shipping insurance premium, and they plug them straight into their existing economic models.
And the model just spits out the impact.
The model mathematically computes how that specific price point degrades consumer purchasing power, raises industrial operating costs, and alters inflation targets.
But because nobody actually knows the duration or the ultimate scale of the conflict, they couldn't just publish one revised forecast, right? They had to map out the boundaries of the unknown.
Which is notoriously difficult.
Very. And that leads us directly to the three distinct economic scenarios the bank drafted during that sprint.
And what's fascinating here is that these scenarios are crucial because they shift the conversation from abstract anxiety to measurable parameters. They categorize the potential futures based on the length and the geographic severity of the conflict.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of each based on the text.
Yeah.
So scenario 1 is defined as the mildest outcome. It assumes a localized, short-duration conflict that theoretically wraps up around late March.
Right.
In the scenario, the bank's models assumed a baseline oil price stabilizing around $86 a barrel.
And mechanically, $86 a barrel is an elevated price, but it isn't structurally destructive.
It's manageable.
Exactly. It caused a brief inflationary spike, but global supply chains can absorb it without fundamentally altering their operations. It's a shock the system is already familiar with.
Then we escalate to scenario 2. The bank defines this as a severe long-term war. And the specific economic trigger they use to define this scenario isn't just a date on the calendar, it's the prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is a massive choke point.
We see this waterway mentioned constantly in the news, but the source emphasizes that 1/5 of the world's global oil and gas flows through the specific narrow strait.
We really have to look at the physical logistics here to understand why this is the trigger for a severe scenario. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a convenient shipping lane,
No.
It is the primary maritime exit for the massive energy output of the Persian Gulf. If that strait is closed, either by a direct military blockade or simply because maritime insurance premiums become so exorbitantly high that commercial vessels refuse to enter, you immediately trap a massive percentage of the global energy supply.
And what does that do to the physical supply chain? You can't just teleport the oil out of there.
Exactly. You force the market to rely on alternative, highly inefficient routes or entirely different supply basins. When ships have to reroute, say, entirely around the Cape of Good Hope, instead of utilizing direct channels, you drastically increase what's called the ton-mile demand.
So it just takes way longer.
Way longer. A ship that used to complete a delivery in 15 days now takes 40 days. That ties up global shipping capacity, creates artificial shortages of vessels, skyrockets freight rates, and causes localized energy deficits. Scenario 2 basically models the structural, compounding friction of the global logistics network breaking down.
Which brings us to Scenario 3, the escalation. This is where the conflict expands beyond localized blockades and directly strikes the vital infrastructure of neighboring energy powerhouses.
Right.
The source specifically names countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
Scenario 3 crosses a really critical threshold. A blocked strait delays energy. A destroyed refinery or a compromised pipeline removes energy from the global balance sheet entirely.
Because you can't just snap your fingers and fix a refinery.
Rebuilding complex petrochemical infrastructure takes years, not weeks. The Economist notes this is the scenario where the global market becomes fundamentally disrupted.
Wow.
The mathematical models for Scenario 3 aren't just calculating delayed shipments, they are calculating the permanent destruction of capital and systemic long-term supply deficits.
You know, while reading the breakdown of these 3 scenarios in the transcript, I ran into the same logical dilemma the interviewer brings up.
The ticking clock issue.
Yes. The interviewer says, wait, if these scenarios are largely predicated on the timeline, how long the conflict lasts, doesn't reality just passively force us into the darker scenarios?
It's a fair point.
Right. If Scenario 1 is defined by a resolution in late March, and we wake up in early April and the conflict is still raging, well, Scenario 1 is mathematically dead. We simply roll over into Scenario 2. It feels incredibly passive, like we're just passengers on a conveyor belt watching the calendar dictate our economic decline.
And the Economist validates that intuition. It is true that time is the primary variable that compounds the severity. But he makes a vital distinction about how institutional models are actually utilized. He clarifies that they are not trying to predict the exact date a war will end.
Right.
The transcript notes that political figures like Donald Trump in a referenced interview might attempt to project specific, rapid timelines for resolution. The bank economists ignore the political predictions completely. They use these scenarios purely to test sensitivities.
Define sensitivities in this context. How is that different from a prediction?
Sure. So a prediction says Scenario 2 will become reality on April 15th.
Okay.
A sensitivity analysis says we do not know when or if Scenario 2 will happen. But if the Strait of Hormuz closes, our models show that Dutch industrial output will contract by exactly 1%, and inflation will hold at X% for exactly Y months.
Oh, I see. It's an if-then statement.
Exactly. It is a diagnostic tool. It allows corporate boards, supply chain managers, and government policymakers to look at a dashboard of triggers. When they see a specific trigger hit in the real world, they instantly know the calculated magnitude of the damage, and they can deploy their contingency plans without having to guess the impact.
It organizes the chaos into actionable data.
Beautifully said, yes.
So let's take that actionable data and look at the immediate impact. Let's assume we are sitting purely in Scenario 1, the mildest possible outcome, a localized short-term conflict. What does the Rabobank model say that actually looks like for the baseline economy?
This is where the text reveals just how sensitive the macroeconomic environment is to even minor shocks. Because before this conflict escalated, Rabobank's internal models show that the baseline inflation rate in the Netherlands was successfully cooling down.
Which was great news.
It was on a stabilizing glide path, projected to hit a healthy 2.2%.
Which is hovering right around the European Central Bank's target mandate of 2.0%. It signals an economy returning to equilibrium.
But the moment the conflict models were run, even in the mild Scenario 1, the economists instantly adjusted that inflation projection upward by 0.5 percentage point, jumping to 2.7%.
Now, 0.5% sounds almost negligible. To a listener, an extra 50 cents on $100 doesn't sound like a systemic crisis.
It sounds like nothing.
Right. But you have to scale that up. On a national macroeconomic level, adding 0.5% of broad-based inflation overnight because of a localized, distant conflict that is a massive friction cost, it completely stalls the economic healing process.
And importantly, that 0.5% increase is an aggregate average. It does not apply uniformly across the economy. The source text dives deep into the specific timeline of how this inflationary shockwave actually moves through different sectors, and it introduces the concept of time lags.
Right. The Economist describes it like a little train of delayed reactions. I think a better way to visualize this mechanical reality is a massive traffic jam on the highway.
Okay, I can see that.
So, the sudden spike in global oil prices is a multi-car accident happening miles ahead. The cars immediately behind the accident slam their brakes instantly. According to the text, those front cars are airline tickets. Flight prices react almost instantaneously to the daily fluctuations of the oil market.
Well, the mechanics of the aviation industry demand it. Jet fuel constitutes an enormous percentage of an airline's immediate operating expenditure.
It's their biggest cost?
Yeah, they don't have the luxury of absorbing massive fuel spikes, so their pricing algorithms dynamically pass that cost directly to the consumer at the point of booking.
Boom, instant inflation. But the cars 2 miles back in the traffic jam, they are still cruising at 65 miles an hour. They have no idea the accident has even occurred. It's going to take them several minutes before they see the brake lights rippling backward and are forced to stop.
Right.
In our economy, those cars in the back are the grocery stores. The text explicitly states that food prices at the supermarket have a massive 6 to 9 month delay before they fully reflect an energy price spike.
6 to 9 months is an enormous delta.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It means the price you are paying for a loaf of bread or a block of cheese in November is a mathematical reaction to a geopolitical standoff that happened in February.
It's wild to think about.
But why does the supply chain operate with such a massive built-in delay? Why doesn't the grocery store just update the price tags the morning the war starts?
The Economist breaks down several distinct mechanical layers that create this buffer. The first layer is basic inventory accounting. Think about a massive food producer. They don't buy their raw ingredients daily.
No.
They have warehouses full of grain, sugar, and packaging materials that they purchased months ago at the older, cheaper market prices. Under standard inventory accounting methods, they're going to produce and sell through that cheaper existing inventory before they are forced to dip into the newer, highly expensive raw materials.
So physical stockpiles essentially act as a temporal shield for the consumer.
Yes, exactly. The second layer is financial hedging and forward contracts. A major food manufacturer or a large-scale agricultural operation doesn't buy their electricity or natural gas on the daily spot market. The volatility would make business planning impossible.
You couldn't run a factory like that.
Right. They utilize the paper markets to insulate their physical operations. They sign long-term, fixed-price contracts to lock in their utility rates for 6, 12, or 18 months at a time.
Okay, so even if the global spot price of natural gas triples on a Tuesday, that specific factory's operating costs remain totally flat because their contract legally binds the utility provider to the old rate.
Exactly. They're insulated by the legal architecture of their contracts. It isn't until those specific contracts expire and the manufacturer is forced to re-enter the market and negotiate new terms in a highly elevated price environment that their actual physical production costs spike. That expiration cycle accounts for a huge portion of the delay.
Okay, what's the third layer?
The third layer the Economist details is a purely behavioral one, and it's based on the brutal power dynamics within the modern supply chain.
Oh, this is the supermarket part.
Yes, this is perhaps the most revealing mechanism. Picture a mid-sized producer, say, a company that bakes commercial bread or processes dairy. Their energy costs go up, their raw materials go up. They approach the massive multinational supermarket chain that buys their product and say, our costs have spiked. We need to raise our wholesale price by 10%.
Seems reasonable.
But the supermarket, which holds near monopsony buying power in the relationship, can simply refuse. They look at the producer and say, we will not accept the price increase. If you raise your prices, we will pull your product from our shelves and source it from your competitor who is willing to eat the cost.
Wow, that puts the mid-sized producer in an impossible bind. They can't force the mega retailer to pay.
So what happens? The producer is forced to absorb those higher energy costs entirely into their own profit margins. They simply bleed cash to maintain the supermarket contract and keep their market share.
That's rough.
They will cannibalize their own margins for as long as they financially can. But eventually, usually around that 6 to 9 month mark, their margins are entirely compressed. They face insolvency. At that breaking point, they have leverage because they physically cannot produce the good anymore. Only then are they forced to pass the actual cost onto the supermarket, who then immediately passes it on to the final consumer.
So the delay isn't a magical grace period. It is a slow, agonizing process of squeezed margins, expiring legal contracts, and inventory depletion.
That's a perfect summary.
It completely rewrites how you perceive the cost of a basic grocery run. But looking at these models, a listener naturally has to ask, didn't we just endure this? We lived through a historic, terrifying energy shock in 2022 following the invasion of Ukraine. Are the economic models just hitting replay on that exact same crisis?
The interviewer poses that exact question, actually. And the Rabobank economist draws a very sharp structural distinction between the 2022 shock and the current geopolitical models.
Right. The first glaring difference is the sheer baseline cost of energy. The text points out that while current gas and oil prices are high and breaking localized records at the pump, like we talked about, the actual wholesale global prices are fundamentally lower.
Much lower.
They are roughly 5 to 6 times lower than the absolute panic-driven peaks we saw in the summer of 2022 when European natural gas markets effectively broke down.
The baseline panic is lower, yes. But the more vital economic distinction the text makes is about the anatomy of the shortages. The geographical center of a conflict dictates the specific chemical and agricultural vulnerabilities of the global supply chain.
Okay, let's compare them mechanically. The 2022 shock was hyper-concentrated around Russia and Ukraine. The global market suddenly realized how deeply reliant it was on that specific geographic basin. Ukraine was functioning as the grain silo of the world.
Right.
So the immediate severe supply shocks hit raw agricultural outputs, wheat, corn, and sunflower oil.
The primary victims of that specific geography were direct grain-based food products. But the models for the current Middle East conflict highlight entirely different vulnerabilities.
Which are what?
Well, the threat isn't to raw grain production. The threat targets the complex downstream industrial inputs of fertilizer and plastics.
Okay, we have to explain the underlying chemistry here to understand why. Why is a conflict in the Middle East threatening the fertilizer used on a farm in Europe?
It comes back to natural gas. To synthesize the nitrogen required for modern commercial fertilizers, specifically through what's called the Haber-Bosch process, which sustains a massive portion of the global food supply, you need hydrogen.
Okay.
And that hydrogen is almost exclusively stripped from methane, which is natural gas. The process requires immense amounts of thermal energy and chemical feedstock. Furthermore, the plastics used in global packaging are largely derived from naphtha and other petrochemicals refined from crude oil. The Middle East is the foundational wellspring for these base hydrocarbons.
The source text includes a fascinating, hyper-specific detail on this. The Rabobank tracking models indicate that sugars and margarines are reacting much faster and with much more volatility to the current price hikes than standard agricultural goods.
Yes, it's very specific.
Why those two specific products?
It is entirely due to the energy intensity of their specific processing and packaging. Refining sugar from beets or cane is an incredibly thermal-intensive process. It requires massive industrial boilers running constantly to crystallize the product.
Got it.
And margarine production involves complex emulsification and hydrogenation processes that demand heavy electrical inputs. On top of the physical production cost, think about how margarine is sold.
It's sold in heavy plastic tubs.
Yeah, exactly. So those specific products face a compounding vulnerability. The natural gas required to power the factory boilers is more expensive, and the petrochemical plastic required to package the final product is more expensive. They are hit on both sides of the industrial equation.
So when you look at the price tag on a tub of margarine, you aren't just paying for the vegetable oil. You are paying a composite invoice for invisible global dependencies.
That's the reality.
You are paying for the international natural gas used to synthesize the fertilizer that grew the raw crops, the intense thermal energy used to refine the ingredients, the petrochemicals required to mold the plastic tub, and the diesel burned to trek it to your local supermarket.
Once you understand the mechanics of that composite price tag, you realize how profoundly fragile the just-in-time global supply chain really is.
Which begs the question, if the vulnerability is this obvious, are global businesses just operating as sitting ducks? Are they just passively hoping the shipping lanes stay open?
Well, the Rabobank source provides some hard data on this.
Yeah, they didn't just model theoretical macroeconomics. They actively surveyed 1,500 Dutch businesses to measure their real-time operational reactions to this fragility.
And the data reveals a massive structural shift in corporate strategy. The survey found that approximately 40% of the companies polled are actively executing strategies to reduce their strategic dependencies.
They are abandoning the just-in-time philosophy. For 30 years, supreme capital efficiency was the only metric that mattered.
It was king.
Holding excess inventory in a warehouse was considered dead capital. You wanted the specific component manufactured in Asia to arrive at the European assembly line on the exact afternoon it was required.
It was a miracle of logistics, honestly, and it suppressed inflation for decades. But it possessed zero slack. If a single ship gets wedged in the Suez Canal, or a vital port shuts down due to a localized pandemic outbreak, or a strait is blockaded by a geopolitical conflict, the entire synchronized global assembly line grinds to a halt.
Right.
The cascading shocks of tariffs, a pandemic, the 2022 energy crisis, and now the Middle East instability have proven that absolute efficiency is fundamentally too dangerous.
So that 40% of businesses are pivoting to a just-in-case model. They are actively engaged in de-risking. What are the actual mechanics of de-risking a massive corporation?
It requires immense capital expenditure to build redundancy. It means a company deliberately chooses to utilize multiple, geographically diverse suppliers, even if one is more expensive, just to ensure they have a backup lifeline.
Okay, so sacrificing margin for safety.
Exactly. It means spending capital to lease massive warehouse space and deliberately holding millions of dollars in dead inventory, purely as a buffer against future shocks. They might re-engineer their product packaging to eliminate reliance on specific petrochemical plastics, or execute nearshoring strategies where they move their manufacturing facilities physically closer to their end consumers despite higher labor costs.
They are willingly sacrificing maximum profit margins to purchase operational resilience. They're building lifeboats.
They are.
But The Economist includes a brutally stark caveat in the data regarding that 40% figure. He admits that this proactive de-risking is heavily skewed toward massive multinational corporations. The big players are building the lifeboats. The average SME, the small and medium enterprise, is lagging far, far behind.
And it is vital to understand that this isn't due to a lack of awareness or desire from the smaller companies. It is a pure function of capital constraints.
Because a local bakery or a mid-sized regional manufacturing plant sees the exact same geopolitical risks as a massive conglomerate.
Sure they do, but they lack the free cash flow to re-engineer their reality. Rewiring an international supply chain, auditing new overseas vendors, testing alternative raw materials, and tying up precious working capital and surplus inventory, that requires a massive balance sheet.
Which they don't have.
Right. A multi-billion-dollar corporation can absorb a 5% hit to their margins to execute a near-shoring strategy over 5 years. A mid-sized manufacturer operating on razor-thin margins simply does not have the capital to build redundancy. They require every dollar of cash flow just to meet their weekly payroll.
So their only operational strategy is to essentially close their eyes, ride out the storm, and hope the supply chain doesn't break.
Precisely. And this highlights how macroeconomic shocks act as brutal accelerators of corporate consolidation.
Oh, that makes sense.
The massive players have the resources to adapt, absorb the friction, and survive the crisis. The smaller, highly leveraged businesses absorb the full brunt of the disrupted supply chain, which historically leads to immense waves of insolvencies or forced buyouts by those exact same larger corporations.
That is a very dark mechanical reality of crisis economics. And the source data proves that this inequality isn't just limited to the divide between corporate conglomerates and small businesses. The economic pain is highly segmented.
It is very targeted.
Yeah. The Rabobank models break down the anticipated damage of Scenario 3, the severe escalation, and it reveals strict fault lines across different industries and, crucially, across different geographical zip codes.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sector breakdown is essential, because it dispels the myth of a uniform recession. An economic shock is never evenly distributed.
Let's look at the specific industrial losers in their severe scenario. The heavy industrial and manufacturing sectors take a massive hit, instantly losing a full 1% of their projected annual growth.
Ouch.
And The Economist points out that in the context of current European stagnation, lopping off 1% essentially zeroes out their entire growth for the year. But the construction sector is hit even harder. The models show their growth flatlining completely. Why is construction so hypersensitive to this specific shock?
Construction is squeezed simultaneously by the physical supply chain and the financial markets.
How so?
Physically, construction relies on heavy, bulky materials: steel, cement, glass. The production of cement and steel are some of the most energy-intensive industrial processes on the planet. When gas prices spike, the cost of raw building materials skyrockets. Financially, construction is entirely predicated on leverage and borrowing.
Right, developers use debt to finance projects.
And how do central banks combat the inflation caused by the energy shock? They raise interest rates. So the developer is suddenly facing material costs that have surged by 20%, and the cost of the capital they need to borrow to buy those materials has doubled.
Oh, wow.
The financial viability of new projects evaporates overnight, and the entire sector halts.
Conversely, the text highlights the sectors that sail through the crisis relatively untouched. The models show that ICT information and communication technology specialized business services and the broad healthcare sector are barely impacted. Their projected growth lines remain remarkably stable.
Because the fundamental inputs of their business models are entirely different. A software development firm or a specialized legal consultancy doesn't rely on container ships full of petrochemicals, and they aren't burning natural gas to forge steel.
No, they just need laptops.
Exactly. Their primary input is human capital and localized electricity to run servers. They are structurally insulated from the physical frictions of the global supply chain.
But there is a fascinating anomaly in the service sector. The hospitality sector, frequently referred to as horeca in the Netherlands, does not escape. The bank's model projects the hospitality sector actually shrinking by 0.3% in a severe scenario. It faces a localized recession. How does a Middle Eastern conflict cause a restaurant in Amsterdam to shrink?
The hospitality sector is subjected to a vicious double squeeze. First, their operational expenditures spike. The Economist lightly jokes in the text that customers prefer a restaurant to be warm in the winter.
Right.
Restaurants have massive, unavoidable utility bills to run industrial kitchens, walk-in freezers, and ambient heating. Their baseline cost to open the doors goes up.
And second, their demand collapses.
Exactly. The restaurant relies entirely on consumer discretionary income. As that little train of inflation hits the average family, as their grocery bill jumps by 10% and their daily commute costs an extra €100 a month, the very first line item they cut from their household budget is the Friday night dinner reservation. So the restaurant's operating costs surge at the exact moment their customer base loses the financial capacity to walk through the door.
It's a perfect storm of squeezed margins. And the Rabobank economists take this data a step further. They don't just map the damage by sector, they run the models geographically. They apply input-output tables to the map of the Netherlands to predict exactly which local municipalities will suffer the most severe economic contraction.
This is the moment macroeconomic theory translates directly into local reality. The zip code you inhabit dictates the severity of the global shock you will experience.
The geographic data in the source is stark. The regions that face the most violent direct hits are the clusters heavily reliant on energy-intensive industry. The text specifically calls out Delfzijl, Zeeuws-Vlaanderen, and the IJmond region.
Where those are heavy industry hubs.
Yeah, these are areas anchored by chemical processing plants, heavy manufacturing, and steel production. When global energy becomes prohibitively expensive, the foundational economic engine of these entire regions is choked off.
But the models also reveal that even the highly modernized, service-oriented economic powerhouses are vulnerable. The text notes that Brainport Eindhoven, globally famous for its advanced high-tech chip machine manufacturing in Amsterdam, with its massive international harbor and trade logistics, both face roughly a 1% contraction in their growth under a severe escalation.
So what does this all mean? This data raises a really vital question for the listener. Or even in Eindhoven, but my personal job is highly insulated. Say I work as a nurse in a local hospital, which is a sector the data explicitly says is safe. Is my livelihood protected? Do I actually feel the macroeconomic contraction of my region if my specific paycheck comes from a safe sector?
It's a critical question regarding local ecosystems. The Economist explains that you cannot divorce your personal economic safety from the structural vitality of your geography. This relies on the concept of the gross regional product, or GRP.
Explain how the GRP impacts the insulated worker.
Think about the velocity of money within a specific town. If the primary industrial engine of that town, say a massive chemical plant, is forced to idle production lines because global natural gas prices are too high, they immediately cut back on overtime pay.
Sure.
They reduce their reliance on local logistics contractors. They might freeze hiring. That means a massive cohort of local workers suddenly has less disposable income.
The primary input of capital to the town shrinks.
Yes. And those industrial workers subsequently stop spending money at the local restaurants, the retail stores, and the local service providers. The secondary economy contracts.
And then the tax base shrinks.
Exactly. As local businesses struggle and revenues fall, the local municipality collects significantly less tax revenue. Suddenly, the local government has a budget shortfall. They delay repairing infrastructure. They freeze funding for local schools. And crucially, they might delay upgrading the equipment or expanding the wards in the very hospital where that insulated nurse works.
Not to mention the impact on the local housing market. If the major regional employer is contracting, demand for housing drops, and the equity in your home stagnates or falls, regardless of where your personal paycheck comes from.
Exactly. The health of the primary industrial cluster sets the baseline economic temperature for the entire zip code. You are structurally tethered to the GRP of your region.
So we have mapped out a scenario where the pain is deeply localized, it targets specific industries viciously, it destroys the margins of small businesses, and it systematically drains the purchasing power of the consumer through delayed inflationary shocks. With all of this widespread, mathematically measurable damage occurring, the final section of our deep dive forces us to look at the entity tasked with fixing it, the government. What is the state doing to mitigate this?
Well, the source text transitions here into a fascinating analysis of the systemic inertia of the public sector compared to the velocity of the private market.
The contrast is glaring. We spent the first half of this discussion detailing how commercial banks, like Rabobank, are running real-time stress tests, scrapping massive quarterly reports over a single weekend, and recalculating the granular impact of a conflict in 48 hours.
Right.
But the source points out that the government's official economic forecasting bureau, the CPB in the Netherlands, operates on an entirely different, incredibly rigid timeline. The interviewer expresses genuine frustration, noting that the CPB released their official figures right after the conflict escalated, but they completely failed to adjust their core inflation models. They simply published the old data and attached a vague disclaimer that things might get worse.
The economist from Rabobank is very measured when discussing his former colleagues at the CPB, but he outlines the fundamental structural difference in their mandates. A commercial bank is engaged in real-time risk management. They must adjust their models daily to ensure institutional survival and regulatory compliance.
It's life or death for them.
Exactly. A government economic bureau, however, is tethered to fixed, massive legislative cadences.
The text mentions specific traditional publication moments, like Prinsjesdag and the Voorjaarsnota. For listeners unfamiliar, Prinsjesdag is the traditional Dutch budget day held in September, and the Voorjaarsnota is the spring memorandum. These are massive, highly choreographed events where the entire national budget is debated and set.
The government relies on these massive bureaucratic cycles to orchestrate the machinery of the state. They physically and legally cannot rewrite the national budget every Tuesday to reflect the spot price of Brent crude oil. They require a stabilized, long-term baseline to execute macro policy.
But that institutional rigidity creates an explosive political tension because the economic pain the citizens are experiencing is real-time. A family staring at a utility bill they cannot afford in February isn't going to patiently wait for budget day in September for systemic relief.
No, they need help immediately.
The text details the immense, immediate political pressure that builds up on elected officials to deploy immediate band-aids to stop the bleeding.
And we saw exactly what those band-aids look like during the 2022 crisis. The source lists the massive interventions deployed, sweeping energy funds to subsidize utility companies, hard price ceilings on consumer gas and electricity bills, aggressive VAT tax cuts, and lowered excise taxes on fuel at the pump. The interviewer vividly notes that the floodgates really opened.
The government essentially stepped in and absorbed the cost of the global shock on behalf of the consumer. But this is where the transcript pivots into a deep, highly consequential economic philosophy. The economist argues forcefully against relying on this Band-Aid approach, and he cites two massive structural reports to back up his warning: the Peter Wennink report and the Mario Draghi report on European competitiveness.
These reports shift the focus from managing the daily crisis to evaluating the underlying long-term health of the economic engine. The Draghi report, in particular, is a foundational critique of the European Union's economic trajectory.
It's pretty grim reading.
It highlights severe structural deficits, a rapidly aging demographic, a massive lag in scaling modern technology compared to the US and China, and fundamentally uncompetitive energy costs.
And the Wennink report specifically addresses the Dutch earning capacity. The Economist distills the findings of these reports into a single, highly concerning metric. He explains that while the overall economy has grown over the past 30 years, the underlying productivity growth, the actual measurable value created by one human working for 1 hour, is structurally stagnating. The data shows it is hovering around a mere 1% annual growth,
which is mathematically insufficient to sustain the social contract.
Explain the math behind that. Why is 1% a crisis?
because of the massive compounding cost of the European welfare state. The text argues that to maintain the current incredibly high standard of living, to adequately fund the expansive healthcare systems required by an aging population, to maintain world-class infrastructure, and to fund the necessary climate transitions, the baseline productivity growth must consistently clear 1.5%.
So there is a fundamental widening gap between the wealth the country actually generates per hour and the wealth the country needs to spend to maintain its society.
Exactly. And this is the core of the economists' argument against the Band-Aid strategy. When the government spends billions of euros artificially subsidizing the price of gasoline or buying down consumer utility bills, they are effectively executing the macroeconomic equivalent of a corporate stock buyback.
That is a fascinating analogy. Let's flesh that out. A corporate stock buyback is when a company takes its excess cash and just buys its own shares to artificially boost the stock price for the current quarter.
Right.
It makes the shareholders happy today, but it does absolutely nothing to improve the underlying product, build a new factory, or invent a new technology.
Precisely. It subsidizes current consumption, but generates zero future value. The source argues that instead of constantly throwing short-term capital at purchasing power, the government must redirect that capital toward long-term structural investments, heavy R&D, advanced high-tech infrastructure, and human capital education.
Because those specific investments possess a mathematical multiplier effect, as the text defines it. You deploy €1 billion into an advanced quantum computing lab or semiconductor research today, and over the next decade, that investment generates new industries, highly paid jobs, and technological patents. It raises the baseline productivity of the entire nation, moving that needle from 1% up to the required 1.5%.
That is how a nation genuinely affords its future.
I understand the pristine logic of the math, but if I am looking at this from the perspective of an elected official or an everyday citizen, I have to challenge this coldly economic view.
Go.
It sounds incredibly rational in a white paper written by a bank, but how does a politician actually stand in front of a family that is literally shivering in their apartment because they cannot afford the natural gas to run their heater today and tell them, "We are sorry, but the state will not help you pay this bill because we must deploy those funds into a high-tech microchip laboratory that will yield a 1.5% productivity increase by the year 2035. You cannot heat a living room with a multiplier effect. You cannot feed your kids with an R&D tax credit."
You have articulated the ultimate paralyzing tragedy of modern governance. The human cost of a severe economic shock is immediate, highly visible, and politically intolerable. Elected officials are required to respond to the tangible suffering of their constituents today, but the economist is warning about the mathematical fatality of ignoring the foundation.
It's an impossible tug of war.
It is. If a state depletes its treasury, constantly managing the symptoms of daily crises, buying down the price of gas, subsidizing the supermarket checkout line, it starves the engine of future growth. Short-term subsidies absolutely keep the lights on today, but without structurally raising that long-term productivity, the underlying economic foundation slowly erodes.
Right.
The state loses its competitive edge globally, and when the foundation finally cracks, the government simply will not possess the sovereign wealth necessary to fund the subsidies for the next inevitable crisis. It is a slow, comfortable path toward systemic poverty.
It is the brutal dilemma of choosing between fixing today's prices and funding tomorrow's survival. And that stark reality brings us to the culmination of our journey today. Let's synthesize the massive mechanics we've unpacked.
We have mapped the anatomy of a crisis from the micro to the macro.
We really have. We started with the visceral shock at the gas pump, that 2.508 per liter that drains your wallet today. We looked behind closed doors of major financial institutions to see the frantic, real-time recalculation of risk, translating geopolitical chaos into highly specific scenarios of economic damage.
And then the ripple effect.
Yes. We broke down the mechanics of the supply chain's little train of time lags, realizing that the inflationary shockwave from today's headlines is currently working its way through expiring contracts and squeezed margins, destined to hit the price of your groceries 6 to 9 months from now.
We examined the structural shift from just-in-time efficiency to just-in-case resilience, noting the dark reality that only massive corporations possess the capital to build those lifeboats, leaving local small businesses exposed. We analyzed the input-output tables of geography, proving that the industrial vitality of your specific region dictates the economic safety of your neighborhood.
And finally, we confronted the philosophical gridlock at the heart of the state. The agonizing choice between deploying temporary financial relief to stop today's bleeding or committing to the long-term structural innovations required to keep the national economy competitive in a fracturing world.
It is a profound look at how invisible systems govern our daily reality.
Which leaves me with a final lingering thought. Something I want you, the listener, to actively consider as you watch these global events unfold. If our hyper-optimized global supply chains are so fundamentally fragile that a conflict an ocean away mathematically guarantees an increase in the price of your bread 9 months later,
Right.
and if our governments are structurally paralyzed between the immediate demands of crisis management and the necessary investments for the future.
It forces a reevaluation of the baseline.
Exactly. Are we rapidly approaching a threshold where crisis economics is no longer a temporary scenario that bank analysts model during a frantic weekend? Is this high-friction, highly volatile environment becoming the permanent, everyday operating reality of the global market? I want you to think about what a permanently localized, less globalized, and significantly more expensive economy might actually look like in your specific neighborhood. What happens to our standard of living when the expensive lifeboat becomes our permanent home?
It suggests a profound and costly paradigm shift for the next decade.
It truly does. So the next time you pull up to that local gas station, you grab that nozzle and you watch those digital numbers flying past. Remember, you are not simply buying fuel, you are paying the final, inescapable invoice for a massive structural global chain reaction. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.